Nolan Wells' throat is missing. Not lost, not destroyed. Held back on purpose by the very first medical examiner who touched his body, and never handed over to the second doctor the family paid to look for the truth, and nobody in that room today could tell you exactly when it's coming back. The independent autopsy on Nolan Xavier Wells has been released, and it is the most significant piece of evidence this case has produced since his body was pulled out of the water off Horn Island more than 2 weeks ago now. That 2-week window is not incidental. It is the same 2-week window during which Nolan's throat, his lungs, and his stomach contents have sat exclusively with Mississippi's own medical examiner's office, without a single piece of that evidence made public. The exam was conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist who spent 7 years as Washington, D.C.'s chief medical examiner, has personally conducted or managed thousands of autopsies over his career, and now serves as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest organization of black physicians in the country. Those credentials matter here specifically because this is not a family relying on an unknown outside expert. Doc Mitchell has spent his career inside the exact kind of medical examiner's office that is currently holding on to Nolan's throat, which means he knows precisely what a routine, thorough autopsy timeline looks like. He performed the second autopsy on July 10th and presented his written findings on July 19th, standing directly alongside Nolan's own parents at the end. NAACP's National Convention in Chicago. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson opened the press conference before Crump ever took the podium, with framing that sets up exactly why this organization chose to attach its own name to this specific moment. He said, "Too often young people, particularly young black men, have their deaths go uninvestigated across the country, not just in Mississippi, and at the end." AACP considers a case like this one worth stepping into precisely because local officials sometimes repeat what individuals involved are saying rather than investigating those same individuals. He was direct about what the organization is and isn't accusing anyone of. Without accusing any specific person of anything, he said, the end. AACP is accusing the state of Mississippi and local officials of being derelict in their duty to conduct a proper investigation, regardless of what that investigation eventually finds. That distinction between accusing individuals and accusing a system is one Johnson repeated more than once, drawing a clear line between what the family and their attorneys are alleging about specific people and what the end. AACP itself is willing to put its name behind as an organization. The official classification of both cause and manner of death is undetermined, pending investigation. That word is doing a lot of work here. Undetermined means a doctor is telling you, in the most careful language available to him, that he does not currently have enough information to say how Nolan Wells died, and that some of the reasons he doesn't have that information, reasons entirely outside his own control, deserve your full attention tonight. Let's start with the finding that made an entire room full of reporters audibly gasp. During a posterior neck dissection, one of several additional procedures Dr. Mitchell performed specifically because the first autopsy hadn't included them, he found a 12 centimeter by 8 centimeter area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, directly over the occipital bone. There was no cut in the overlying skin. There was no fracture in the skull underneath it. Doc Mitchell wrote that the cause of that discoloration is unclear, and that because of how decomposed the body was by the time he received it, and because there was no associated skin or bone injury, the finding is inconclusive on its own for proving any injury that happened before death. But he specifically flagged it in his report as significant enough to warrant further investigation. That's a doctor telling you in plain terms, I don't know what caused this, and neither should you assume you do, but this is not something I'm willing to let disappear from the record. Dr. Freda Fisher, a physician who watched the full presentation and broke it down afterward, said this specific finding was the one that made her want to know far more than the report could tell her. She pointed out that the report only confirms there was no fracture and no obvious external skin injury at that location. What it can't tell you, because Dr. Mitchell never had access to it, is what the inside of Nolan's skull actually showed. Was there any bleeding underneath, an intracranial hemorrhage that could point directly to blunt trauma as an actual cause of death, rather than something that simply happened to the tissue afterward? That single missing piece, whether there was bleeding inside the skull itself, is exactly the kind of finding that would have come from the state's original examination. The one performed while Nolan's body was still fresh from the water, and it's exactly the kind of finding nobody outside Mississippi's own medical examiner's office has seen yet. Then there's the throat. This is the finding that deserves the most attention, and it's worth explaining exactly what it means and doesn't mean. When Dr. Mitchell received Nolan's body for the second autopsy, the anterior neck structures, meaning the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone, were not included. Those pieces stayed with the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, the agency that performed the very first autopsy. Dr. Mitchell wrote that retaining those structures for additional evaluation is common forensic practice, something he himself did routinely during his own years as a chief medical examiner, typically when there's a specific reason to want a closer look, including concerns about neck trauma or compression. Here's why that matters so much. The hyoid bone and the surrounding cartilage are exactly what a forensic pathologist checks when they're trying to determine whether someone was strangled, choked, or had pressure applied to their throat. Dr. Mitchell wrote plainly that a posterior neck dissection performed without access to those anterior structures is incomplete, and that he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to or a cause of Nolan's death. He said he would need Mississippi's medical examiner to give him access to those retained structures before he could finish his own evaluation. This detail split expert opinion in a way that deserves real attention tonight. Attorney Monique Presley, a legal expert who's both examined and deposed forensic pathologists in her career, made the point that retaining anterior neck structures for closer examination is genuinely standard practice, not evidence of anything hidden, and that the state very likely still has those pieces because its own investigation, including toxicology, isn't finished yet. A separate physician on the same broadcast, Dr. Freda Fisher, said she found the absence of that information highly suspicious, specifically because even without a completed toxicology report, a medical examiner should be able to say, right now, today, whether the hyoid bone was intact or fractured, since that's a direct physical observation, not something that requires weeks of lab work. Both of those positions come from people with real expertise. One frames this as ordinary process, the other frames it as a piece of basic information being withheld longer than it needs to be. It's fair to hold both of those readings at once rather than pretend this detail has one obvious explanation. What both experts agree on, even from opposite conclusions, is that this single missing piece is not a minor detail. Whether the hyoid bone is intact or fractured could be the single fact that moves this classification off of undetermined and toward an actual answer in either direction. Dr. Fisher made the point that this specific piece of information doesn't require toxicology, doesn't require weeks of lab processing, and doesn't require anything beyond a physical examination that could have been documented the moment the state's own medical examiner first looked at Nolan's body. That's exactly why its absence from this report reads differently to her than a routine, unremarkable delay would. Beyond the neck, Doc Mitchell also couldn't directly examine Nolan's airway or lungs for water, or his stomach for its contents, because those organs had already been removed and dissected during the first autopsy before his body was ever transferred to Washington. That matters more than it might sound like at first. Confirming water in the lungs is one of the most basic ways pathologists distinguish a genuine drowning from a body that entered the water after death from some other cause. Without that direct observation, Dr. Mitchell said he simply cannot confirm it himself, and has to rely entirely on whatever the original examiner recorded. Dr. Fisher explained why that specific gap matters so much medically, since wet lungs versus dry lungs is one of the clearest physical markers separating an accidental drowning from a body that was placed in water after dying some other way. It's a distinction Dr. Mitchell could have made himself directly if those organs had still been available to him. Instead, that observation exists only in whatever the original Mississippi Examiner recorded and hasn't been shared publicly by either side. Here's the sentence in this report that matters most of all, the one Ben Crump specifically asked everyone in that room to sit with. Doc Mitchell wrote that in any death occurring in or around water, especially involving someone who could swim, the central question is how that person entered the water in the first place, whether conscious or unconscious, whether forced or unforced. He wrote plainly that he does not know the answer to that question, and that for these reasons. This pathologist cannot rule out whether any intervening non-natural factors contributed to or caused Nolan's death. A board-certified forensic pathologist in a formal written report says he cannot rule out foul play. That's not speculation from a commentator, that's the actual medical finding. That sentence is easy to overstate in either direction, so it matters what it does and doesn't accomplish. It is not a finding that foul play occurred. Doc Mitchell never claims that. What it is, in the exact careful language forensic pathologists use, is an acknowledgement that the evidence currently available to him doesn't allow him to rule that possibility out, the same way it doesn't allow him to rule it in. That's a meaningfully different statement than either Nolan was murdered or this was simply an accident, and both of those oversimplified versions are already circulating online tonight. The actual finding sits in the much harder, much less satisfying space between them, an honest acknowledgement of what remains unknown rather than a verdict in either direction. Dr. Mitchell closed his report with 7 specific outstanding questions, laid out one after another in his own words what circumstances led to Nolan entering the water, what position his body was in when it was found, whether there was water in his airway, whether there is evidence of injury to the front of his neck, whether there is evidence of any bleeding inside the skull, what his stomach contents showed, and what the toxicology report says, since that hasn't come back yet from either side. Every one of those 7 questions remains completely open tonight, unanswered by anyone on either side of this case. Most of those 7 questions don't require new evidence to be collected. They require access to material Mississippi's own medical examiner's office has already had in its possession since before Nolan was ever buried. What Dr. Mitchell did rule out is worth stating just as clearly because a fair reading of this report has to include it. His dissection of the face, the ribs, the pelvis, the back, the buttocks, the arms, and the legs found no fractures and no deep tissue injuries anywhere on Nolan's body. Whatever happened to him, this specific autopsy found no evidence of a beating, no broken bones, nothing consistent with a severe physical assault across his body. The only unresolved physical finding is that one area at the back of his head and the missing information about his neck and airway. Doc Fisher made a point about this balance that speaks to how carefully this entire report was put together. She said, Dr. Mitchell simply laid out what the body could tell him and what it couldn't, letting the findings speak for themselves rather than pointing toward his own theory about what happened. His approach was, here's what I found, here's what I could not examine. And here's exactly why, without speculating that the red discoloration was caused by a blow to the head or that the missing neck structures meant something was being covered up. That kind of restraint, delivering findings without dressing them up as conclusions, is exactly what you'd want from a forensic report this significant, and it's worth crediting alongside the findings themselves. There's a detail in Crump's own remarks that got less attention than it deserved today. Crump said members of the United Cajun Navy told the family that when Nolan's body was recovered, he was found face down and fully clothed. Christine Wansley responded to that directly, pointing out that in the last footage anyone has of her son. The video recorded at 2:23 that afternoon and reviewed by investigators, he wasn't wearing a shirt at all. Her question was simple and direct. At what point did he put one back on? Nobody has an answer to that yet either. Christine and Elmore both spoke before the findings were presented, and what they said frames everything that came after. Christine said the only question they have is what happened to their son, and that they've been degraded publicly throughout this entire process, questioned about their parenting, their fundraiser, even accused of racism, simply for demanding transparency. She said having the preliminary results of an independent autopsy and hearing nothing at all from local authorities is heartbreaking. Elmore described the version of events they've been given as not matching who Nolan was, and made a point that deserves to be repeated plainly. If Nolan truly chose, on his own, to stay behind on that island, why would an 18-year-old give up his phone and his car keys to do it? He said, if that was really the plan, Nolan would have said, give me my phone, I'm staying behind, give me my keys, I'm staying behind. Instead, according to the friend's account, he left with nothing. One more detail from Christine's remarks connects directly to everything Dr. Mitchell laid out afterward. She said the last time she had any real contact with Jackson County Sheriff's Department was a single text message she sent herself a day or two after Nolan's body was recovered, simply asking for an update. The response she got back was that investigators were still interviewing people. Nothing more specific than that. That's the last direct communication this family says they've had from local law enforcement, which means everything Dr. Mitchell's report couldn't answer tonight is sitting with an agency that, by the family's own account, has gone silent since almost immediately after Nolan was found. Crump used this same appearance to draw a comparison worth reporting accurately rather than softening. He named two other 18-year-old black men who died the same holiday under circumstances he described as strikingly similar. One, a young man who drowned on a fishing trip with two white friends, who allegedly threw away his phone and his clothes and deleted their own messages with him afterward, and have so far only been charged with tampering with evidence, not with anything connected to his actual death. The other, a young man shot in the head at a house party on the 4th of July, where the surviving friends told police it was an accidental shooting during a game of Russian roulette, and where, according to the family, no gunshot residue test was ever performed on anyone's hands. Crump's point, delivered directly to the room, was that he believes none of those three cases would have been handled the same way if the roles were reversed, if a black teenager had been the last person seen with a white victim. In each of the three cases Crump named, the pattern is the same. A young black man dies during a holiday gathering, and the explanation offered afterward comes entirely from the people who were the last ones with him. Whether you find that comparison persuasive is up to you, but it's important to hear exactly what he said rather than a version smoothed over in either direction. These two additional cases add something specific to tonight's update, beyond the emotional weight of the comparison itself. Neither of those two deaths has any direct evidentiary connection to what happened to Nolan on Horn Island. They're separate incidents, separate states, separate investigations entirely. What connects them in Crump's framing is a pattern of behavior from surviving friends, disposing of a phone, disposing of clothing, deleting messages, followed by an early, confident declaration from law enforcement that the death was accidental before any thorough investigation had taken place. Whether that pattern reflects something real and recurring, or whether these are simply three unrelated tragedies that happen to share surface-level similarities, is exactly the kind of question a genuinely transparent, thorough investigation is supposed to be able to answer one way or the other, rather than leave hanging indefinitely. The state of Mississippi's own autopsy, conducted first, remains unreleased. Toxicology from both sides is still outstanding. Crump has said he wants Dr. Mitchell to testify directly in front of a grand jury so that everything in this report and everything the state's examiner knows that Dr. Mitchell doesn't can be weighed together in one place rather than argued about separately in press conferences. Sheriff Ledbetter's office, for its part, has continued saying that initial interviews suggest Nolan chose to stay on the island and that his friends believed he'd get a ride with someone else, and that those friends have been cooperating throughout the entire process so far. One particular gap in how this whole announcement was handled today says something about where public scrutiny still needs to go next. During the question and answer portion of the press conference, not a single reporter in that room asked Crump or the family directly what, if anything, they've been told about the status of Mississippi's own official autopsy. Given that the state's examiner has now had this case for over 2 weeks longer than Dr. Mitchell has, and given that the state is the only party holding on to Nolan's throat, his lungs, and his stomach contents, that seems like the most obvious follow-up question available, and it went unasked. That's not a criticism of the family or their legal team. It's a reminder that the very people whose job it is to press for answers in these moments don't always ask the sharpest possible question, and that leaves it to everyone still watching and asking questions afterward to keep pushing for it ourselves. This report didn't give anyone a cause of death. What it gave everyone is a specific, itemized list of exactly what's still missing and exactly who's holding on to each missing piece. The state has Nolan's throat. The state has whatever it observed about his lungs and his stomach before those organs were ever removed. The state has its own toxicology results. Every one of those pieces sits with Mississippi's own medical examiner's office right now, tonight, unreleased, while a family stands in front of the entire country asking why, just 2 days after they buried their son. That's not a technicality sitting in an evidence locker somewhere. That's a mother and a father standing at a podium having just buried their 18-year-old son, still waiting on the 3 pieces of physical evidence most likely to tell them how he actually died. I want to know what you think about that missing throat specifically, since it's clearly the detail that hit hardest in that room today. Does the explanation that this is standard practice sit right with you? Or does the fact that a medical examiner could describe the physical condition of that bone today without waiting on any lab work make the silence feel like something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. We're going to keep following this the moment Mississippi's own autopsy or either side's toxicology report comes out, whichever lands first. Subscribe so you don't miss it, because I don't think either one is going to stay quiet for very much longer. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.